Good morning, everyone. My name's Nadia, and Career Transition Center is pleased to welcome you to our June webinar, The Art of Informational Interviewing. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. For the following 30 to 40 minutes, we'll present you with an overview of the skills and best practices for preparing for an informational interview. And just a few housekeeping notes. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. We will address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. In addition, we will have 3 poll questions so each of you can participate in this program. And let me introduce you to today's presenter. Marty Gauhauer currently serves as the Assistant Director of Employer Relations and Recruiting at Loyola University Chicago. In addition to managing 8 university career fairs, Marty regularly conducts workshops on career-related topics. Prior to his work in higher ed, Marty spent over 20 years in the advertising and marketing industries, with the majority of his career at Leo Burnett in account management. Marty holds a BS in advertising from the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, as well as a master's in higher education from Loyola University Chicago. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Marty Gauhauer to present The Art of Informational Interviewing.
Thank you, Nadia. Good morning or afternoon, as it may be, for the folks that are out there listening on the webinar today. Hope everybody is doing well. As Nadia mentioned, what we're here today to talk about is the art of informational interviewing, and just to briefly touch on a couple of things before we step into the presentation. I just wanted to really ask several poll questions that'll help me sort of direct my presentation as we go along. The first one is, how long have you been in transition? And you'll note there's several different answers that you can put down there. 1 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 months to a year, more than a year. And part of the reason that I bring that up is myself. I was in transition for 14 months actually, and the timing of my transition matched up almost exactly with the dates of the Great Recession. And in the midst of that transition, I used the services of the CTC, the Career Transition Center, and conducted it was 125 informational interviews during that time. So in doing that, some folks at the CTC asked me to put together a presentation on what I was doing in informational interviewing, and sort of that's all of the genesis of what you're about to hear today. Then the next question, okay, thank you so much to the folks that answered. The next question was, how much do you know about informational interviewing? Is it something that you've heard about before, never heard about before? Have you done some, a few informational interviews, etc.? So Nadia, if you can ask that next poll question, that'd be great. Okay. Hopefully that next poll question will be put on very soon. Thank you so much, Nadia, for pulling that up. And, as I mentioned, in the midst of doing those informational interviews, an accountability group that I belong to at the CTC, they asked me to pull together information about what I was going through from an informational interviewing perspective, and I was able to put together a presentation that sort of led to the one that we have now. And it looks like from the polls that we've got coming back in, there's some folks out there who, the majority have, in some way, shape, or form, have done maybe one or two, or perhaps a little bit more, and there's some out there as well who haven't really done it before. So that's helpful. And then Nadia, if we can ask that sort of last question, and sort of what stage of career transition you might be currently in, be it discovery, planning, action phase, that, you know, the terminology that the CTC uses. And again, the reason that I'm asking that particular question is this tool, and we'll cover this as we go through the presentation, is very flexible. So really, no matter where you might be in your transition, the tool can be used to really help either discover some areas you may not know about, or it can help you sort of hone in and learn more about an area, a target that you're interested in, or you could actually use it very strategically. Yeah, if you know there's a position that's open and that you may know the hiring manager, you can actually use the tool in that way as well. You know, to get even smarter and perhaps get yourself in front of that hiring manager in the hopes of perhaps impressing them enough so that they would invite you to interview for the position. Okay, thank you so much for everybody for answering the poll questions. So what I'm going to do now then is just jump right into the presentation itself, and hopefully you can see the screen again. And so I'm going to just briefly cover some of the important aspects of job search. I call it Job Search 101, that you're all sort of participants in the CTC. Hopefully this is all second nature to you now, but it never hurts to repeat some of these things. And again, as Nadia mentioned, my background is in advertising, so bear with me if I use some marketing terminology, but it is very applicable to the job search. So really the key thing that a successful job search requires building is A, your brand. You know, who are you? What are your strengths, skills, and abilities that sort of make you unique and set you apart? In the world of advertising, we call that USP, your unique selling point. In this particular case, it's really, you know, again, who you are and what sets you apart. That's really important because that helps you distill it down into your elevator pitch. And your elevator pitch is basically a 30-second to 60-second pitch that you put together that highlights those strengths, skills, and abilities. And also, importantly, lets folks know what you're looking for. And that's, of course, critically important. Without that ability to talk with people and let them know who you are and what you're looking for, it's very hard for them to sort of help you when it comes to your job search. The important piece is your target list. And your target list really is made up of either industries that you think you might be interested in, or companies that you think you might be interested in, or positions within companies that you might be interested in. Again, no matter what phase that you might be in your job search, be it discovery, planning, or whatever it might be, it's important to have some sort of an idea of where you might be headed. And again, that's something where informational interviewing can be very helpful in setting that up and pulling it together for you. And then importantly is your network, right? Network often has sort of a negative connotation. It's sort of a cold-sounding word, but really your network is individuals that you might know, be it friends, family, colleagues, your hairdresser, folks that you go to. Those people are part of your network, and they are critically important when it comes to your job search. So those are all key elements to your search that, again, I know that the CTC covers off well. And things that you need to be concentrating on and being on top of as you go through your search. And again, because you're a part of the CTC, and something that I learned along the way as being part of the CTC is, never do this thing alone. It can be tempting sometimes to be sitting in front of the computer, and applying to some positions online and congratulating yourself on your search. But a search really is so much more, and in order to do it effectively, you really do need to rely on others. And that's where the CTC really comes into play. At least it did for me during my search. And to that point, the CTC offers a number of different services that are provided either virtually or also in person if you happen to be in the Chicagoland area and can utilize their services. I sort of broke it out into three pieces of the pie. Coaches are critically important because they're great individuals to meet with on a regular basis, to go over your job search plan and get some objective feedback on how you're doing. Peer groups are also important. Peer groups are those individuals that you'll meet with again on a regular basis and share your stories with how your search is going. From an emotional support standpoint, they were critically important to me because if you're anything like me when I was going through the job search is very much like an emotional roller coaster. Sometimes you're way up, sometimes you're way down, and it's great to have a peer group, other people that are going through the same thing that you're going through, that you can go share your stories with and get that support that's needed. And then there's the accountability group, and an accountability group is, again, a group that meets on a weekly basis, gets together. Typically there are about 6 to 8 people, where you report out very pragmatically what happened during the past week in your search. You lay out what your goals and objectives were for the week, and then you report out to those 6 to 8 folks and say, okay, I either achieved those objectives or I didn't. And those things are really important. I apologize for the phone ringing. So from that perspective, there's a stat actually that I want to mention. There's some research that's been done on accountability groups, and for the people that take part in an accountability group, the people are 38% quicker to landing their next position than folks who are not a part of accountability groups. And again, if you Google it, or if you even reach out to folks at the CTC, they have information about what those accountability groups are, and you can work to establish those groups amongst yourselves as peers, as we did. And interestingly enough, the accountability group that I was a part of, a member of that group asked me to pull together an initial presentation about informational interviewing, which sort of led to the thing that I'm presenting today. So it can be very helpful from a number of different ways as well. So, moving along, what is the single most important element to your search? Right? You hear that all the time. It's networking. And why is networking so important? There's a number of stats that you'll see out there, but in a regular economy, you'll hear that 80 to 90% of jobs have been landed through some form of networking. And as everybody knows, the economy hasn't been really in a normal state for quite some time now, so that number might even be higher. And the other important stat about networking that I found out, and this comes through a source of Harrison. I don't know how many folks out there may have heard of them, but they are one of the premier outplacement services in the country, offering services very similar to the CTC. And one of their senior vice presidents, Orville Pearson, who has written a number of excellent job search books, which again, if you Google them, you can find them or find them at your local library. One of the things that he noted, and this comes from their database, from Harrison's database of many thousands of job seekers that come through and utilize their facilities. In essence, you need to talk to 25 decision makers to land your next position. And by talk to, it's not a formal interview that you would be doing with these decision makers, these hiring managers, but it could be even something that may happen at a cocktail party that you go to, or perhaps one of your child's events that you may be going to, and you're talking to another parent and they happen to be a hiring manager. Again, what they found is that's pretty much what you need to talk to in order to land to the next position. And that was helpful to me because it helped me understand, pretty much target-wise how many folks ultimately I would need to talk to. Now, 25 is a manageable number, but it's the tip of the iceberg, the bottom of the funnel, however you want to look at it. You still need to talk to, obviously, many more people to get to those 25 decision makers. But for me, it was helpful to have sort of a target to shoot for. And so what networking really is, as I mentioned earlier, it's simply getting the word out, right? It's letting your family, your friends, your former colleagues know what it is you might be looking for. And by doing that, if you can do it simply, that's where that elevator pitch comes in so importantly. They can help you out. In that little quote that I have there, you on the motorcycle, that sort of comes from the Blues Brothers. I don't know how many folks out there might remember the Blues Brother movie, but if you remember them driving around with that big old megaphone on top of their car trying to scare up folks for their concert that they were doing, that's really what networking is, just getting out there and letting people know what it is you're looking for. And the more you do it, the less it becomes like a pitch, and the more it becomes like having a conversation, the more you feel comfortable doing it. And again, it's something that you can do in person, or the great thing nowadays is you can also do it virtually, and that's where LinkedIn comes into play. And I typically, when I do this thing in person, I ask how many folks have a LinkedIn profile, but I'm hoping that everyone does indeed have a LinkedIn profile, because it's a wonderful place to go network, and you can do research about potential target companies that you might have, etc. So if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, make sure that you get one as soon as you possibly can. They're very easy to set up. And then the last point is, making sure that you utilize your alumni offices. Many universities have active alumni groups that you can utilize to network with, and actually also very many high schools have alumni offices that you can utilize to network with. So please use them when it comes to networking, as well as professional associations. Living here in the Chicagoland area where I do, there's pretty much a professional association for any job you might think of, any industry that you might think of, and those are great places to go and network with individuals. So, now to the meat of the presentation. You've gotten a contact name at a target company or an industry that you're really interested in. So now what? That's where the informational interviewing can really come into play. But before I get into what it is, I want to start with what it's not, because it's often confused with a job interview, and it is definitely not a job interview. I'll stress that again. It is not a job interview. There's no quicker way actually to kill an informational interview than by treating it like a job interview, by treating it as an opportunity to ask for a job. So in that case, make sure that you leave your resume either at home when you're doing an informational interview, or you can bring it along in your briefcase, and if the individual that you're doing an informational interview with asks to see it, then you can pull it right out and give it to them. You don't want to have that out in front. The reason being is, as soon as you put that resume out in front of somebody without them asking for it, it immediately feels like you're asking for a job, like you're trying to make an informational interview into a job interview. And again, it is most definitely not one. So now that we've talked about what it's not, what is it? Well, It's a highly focused discussion with a networking contact for the sole purpose of gaining information or knowledge. Again, it's pretty much like what the title says, right? Informational interviewing. You've got a networking contact, you're meeting with them to learn more about what it is that they do, what industry that they work in, etc. So, again, if it's not about a job then, and I've heard this from a number of individuals when I present, is, well then, why should I spend any time doing an informational interview? Well, there are a number of reasons why it's so helpful and so important. First and foremost, you can learn about the skills and abilities needed to succeed in a position or a company. Again, oftentimes, if you're in the discovery or the planning phase, you may be thinking about a position within an industry or a company that you're interested in, and you think you know what you need to be successful. And I emphasize you think you know, because when you actually talk to somebody who's doing that job, you may well find out that those skills and abilities are very different than the ones that you thought were needed. And in doing so, you can begin to assess, well, do I have those skills or abilities? Do I want to utilize those skills or abilities? That's where informational interviewing can come into play. The next is probably, at least in my mind, one of the most important things that an informational interview can provide you. And that's identifying culture and fit potential. I'm in the camp that really believes that cultural fit is probably one of the most important things to find for you to be successful in your next position. Because just logically speaking, it seems to me to make sense that, if you feel like you fit in, if you feel comfortable, you're going to be doing your best work. And if you're doing your best work, the chances of you succeeding are going to be the strongest that they will be. And trying to identify cultural fit through a traditional job interview is extremely difficult because the types of questions sometimes that are needed are ones that you're not going to want to ask in a traditional job interview. Things like, how many hours do you spend in a day working? Are people allowed to go on vacation? Those are the kind of things that you can find out in an informational interview that, again, questions that you probably would not want to ask in an actual job interview. This one's rather obvious, and even though in an informational interview is different than a job interview, nonetheless, you are still brushing up on your interviewing skills because you'll get questions asked of yourself, and you can answer them, and in doing so, you're beginning to improve those skills or brush up on those skills, again, if you haven't used them in a little while. Importantly, if you're doing informational interviewing correctly, you'll also be generating additional contacts to follow up with and expanding your network, which again, from what we talked about just earlier, we know how important building out that network can be. Another thing that informational interviewing can do is help you increase your visibility. And what do I mean by that? Again, I had been operating in the world of advertising and was interested in higher education, which is what I transitioned into, and didn't really know much. And so a part of my informational interviews that I did was in the world of higher education. And the more and more and more I talked to people within the world of higher education, and specifically in the area of career service or career offices within universities, the more and more I began to see really how small of a world that was, how many individuals knew one another. And again, in a difficult job market, having people know who you are, or a little bit of word of mouth about you is critically important. And that's what can happen if you do informational interviews, because if you talk to enough individuals in that specific industry, you start to become a known quantity, and that's always a good thing. And again, I know that it's a small world within higher education because I'm in that now. I also know it's true of advertising and advertising industry, having been in that for a number of years as well. So I'd wager the guess it's probably true of most industries that are out there. And again, informational interviewing is a great tool to help you sort of build your visibility really in any area that you might be interested in. The next step is you can discover an area or a field you never knew about. That was certainly true of my case. Again, listening to the advice of that individual that I mentioned earlier, Orville Pearson, the SVP from Lehigh Harrison, he recommends going down sort of 3 parallel paths as you conduct your job search. Again, because that will help you decrease the time in transition. And so for my search, I was really interested in 3 areas. As Nadia had mentioned, I had been doing account management in advertising, so I was interested in doing something very similar on the client side that's called brand management. So that was one of my areas I was exploring. The other area was the utilization of my knowledge of German culture and language and German business. I had the great opportunity to work overseas for a couple of years in Germany and really enjoyed it. I thought, well, maybe that is something that I could do here in the Chicagoland area. And finally, the third area was higher education. I was always interested in that area, and this was a great opportunity to explore it while I was in transition. But I didn't know where a person with my skills, my ability, my background could actually fit in higher education. So I went off and started talking to people in higher education and learned about the area of career services within universities. I didn't really know anything like that existed, and the more and more I talked to people in that area and found out what you needed to do to be successful in that area, the more and more I thought, this could be a good fit for me. So again, you can discover an area or a field you never knew about. And then finally, again, even though informational interviews aren't really about, isn't really a job interview, you can stumble across a hidden job market. An example there is I was speaking with somebody at a community college in the Chicagoland area about my marketing background, and then I got a call in an informational interview. Then I got a call, or rather an email from that individual several months later, reaching out to me and asking if I was still in the job market. And I said I was, and he said, well, would it be okay if I passed along your resume to the president of another university who's currently looking for a marketing person? He's unhappy with the marketing that's being done, and I was impressed with your resume. And I said, of course, please pass it along. And that position actually hadn't even been posted yet, and I had the opportunity to meet with the president and talk with them even before the position was posted. Now, I didn't get that position, but I was actually able to get my foot in the door for a interview even before it was posted. And that was an outcome, actually, of an informational interview that I had done. And here's an important thing, actually, another difference via a job interview. And I bring this one up because actually the person who asked me to initially do this interview, this was sort of something that she was intimidated by about informational interviews. She felt really intimidated to reach out to people, to ask people to do an informational interview. And sort of when I explained to her a critical difference is, in an informational interview, you are the one who's in control. You are the person that's reaching out to somebody and asking them to do an interview. That's very different than a job interview. A job interview, really the locus of power actually sits on the other side of the desk, right? Those are the individuals that are asking the questions of you and that you're trying to land that position. in an informational interview, very different. You're the one who's running it. And when I let her know about that, that sort of made her feel a lot better about it. It calmed her nerves about reaching out to individuals to do an informational interview. So, I've mentioned about the flexibility of the tool, and one of the reasons that I had asked, where everybody's at in their transition. The informational interview is a very flexible tool, and you can really use it in a number of different ways, and I've sort of broken it out into 3 sort of phases. So if you're in that beginner stage, that discovery stage, sort of the way I was, it's a great tool because, you're exploring opportunities. You just want to learn what you can about a new industry maybe that you didn't know about. And who's you fit for when you reach out to do an informational interview when you're in that phase? Really anybody that works in that industry, right? You're just trying to learn as much as you can about that particular industry. And you're willing and can talk to anybody who's in that area because they're going to be able to tell you sort of what that industry is about, and from their purvey, what skills are sort of needed to be a player in that area. The next phase, once you sort of figured out, okay, this is a great industry, is, all right, you start honing in on what position you think you might be successful about. And this is phase I call clarification and validation, right? You've identified that position within an industry, perhaps a company that you are really interested in. So who should you be talking to at that point? Well, you really want to be talking to people that are doing the thing that you are interested in, the thing that you want to be doing. Because in doing so, you'll be able to clarify and validate, the skills and abilities that are needed to be successful in that position. And who's better to talk to than the people who are actually doing it? And then finally, there's phase 3. And that's what I call strategic prospecting, right? That's when you've nailed down, this is a position that I want to do. Now what you're trying to do is get yourself in front of some hiring managers, those people that are typically 1 or 2 levels, higher than that position that you're interested in, because they're typically the ones that are doing the hiring. And it's good to talk with them to know, again, from their point of view, what it is that they're looking for that particular position, in that particular company, because you get it right from the horse's mouth what it is they're looking for. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, but you can craft that sort of an informational interview a little bit differently as well to make sure that you're presenting yourself in the best possible light. Again, assuming that at this point, done your homework, you know that this is what you want to potentially do, you can craft an informational interview to show that you indeed do have those skills and abilities needed to be successful in that position. So now we're going to move into sort of the process, the pragmatic end of this thing. How do you get an informational interview? And what I'll talk about is a little bit sort of what worked for me. And the reason I term or title this presentation really the art of informational interviewing is that, everybody's different. Everybody's going to run it, their process a little bit differently. You have to do what works best for yourself. I'll talk about what was helpful to me, and perhaps you can use some of these tips as you proceed along your path of doing informational interviewing. So the process that worked for me was to send a request via email or LinkedIn to a networking contact. And when I initially started off on this thing, I'm sort of old school. I composed it in Word and put together a letter and actually mailed something off, and then promptly heard nothing about my request for an informational interview. So it didn't take me very long to learn that certainly email is the way business is done nowadays, and asking for informational interviews, emails is a great way to go. And LinkedIn now as well is another great way to ask for an informational interview. So I highly recommend using that tool. So after I send out the request, typically I had a process down where I sent And then once the date was agreed to and the time was agreed to for the informational interview, of course, held the interview, sent then a follow-up thank you note, and then also updated those individuals on my progress, on my job search progress as time went along. So, again, this is what worked for me. A recommended request email, or something that you might send out through LinkedIn, is in the first paragraph, mention how you got their name, if it's a warm lead, and hopefully again through your networking you're able to start off by generating some contact names that you can reach out to for informational interviews. But you can mention how you got their name and why you're reaching out to them. In the second paragraph, and the second paragraph is really important, you want to give them a little bit of a background about yourself to hopefully establish credibility of who you are, and give them a reason to say, sure, I'd be happy to speak with you. And that third paragraph is all about the ask. It's where you ask for time for a brief informational interview, and again, you thank them in advance for consideration. And this next thing, which I'm hoping everybody can see, is an ask that I had put out to the director of the Career Center at University of Illinois, my alma mater. And I'll read through it briefly, and the more I've given this, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things folks have played back to me that they would do differently that I think were great additions. So this person's name was actually Gail Rooney. So dear Gail, as director of the Career Center, your time is extremely valuable, so I'll keep this brief. Matt Burns, director of the placement at University of Texas, Austin, pass along your name as a helpful contact as I manage my career transition. Again, you start to see like the breadth of this thing, how it builds out. I had done an informational interview with the director of placement at University of Texas in Austin. Now, I didn't fly there to do that. I actually did that informational interview over the phone. But nonetheless, I was talking to somebody halfway across the country in my quest to do informational interviews. So that next paragraph is what I term a brief overview, but if everybody can see that, you see it's rather long. So I would definitely not have it be this long anymore. You want that paragraph, again, the purpose of it is to establish the credibility of yourself. And, however long it needs to be, typically let's call it 2 to 3 sentences would be fine. This particular paragraph definitely goes on too long. And then the last paragraph, as I mentioned, is all about the ask. As the next step in my career, I'm passionately interested in applying my talents in the higher education arena, specifically in career services. In pursuit of that goal, I'd like to ask for 20 minutes of your time to gain your perspective. I will call your office next week to arrange a time for a brief informational interview. Thank you in advance for your time and consideration. Again, that last paragraph is all about the ask. And there's a couple things I want to point out in here. Number one, I'm the person in control. I'm doing the asking. So I point out in that I will call their office next week to arrange a time for that informational interview. Again, I'm leading this process. I state that up front, and then I follow up on it. That is critically important to doing successful informational interviewing. The other little tip that I found out along the way is, as you'll note, I asked for 20 minutes of time. And although I was always very conscious of and respectful of people's time at the 20 minutes, not everybody gave me actually at least 30 minutes of their time, right? Because most people schedule their calendars in 30-minute increments. By asking for 20, most of the time I was actually able to get 30. So a little bit of a tip there. With that, I'll move on. Typically when I do this in person, I ask people to draft up their own requests, but we'll skip that for today. back, you followed up with a phone call. They have said, yes, I'm willing to do an informational interview. You've agreed to a time and a place. How do you conduct an informational interview? A couple points I want to mention here, actually several points. Number one, be prepared. Have your questions scripted in advance. Again, you are leading this process. You want to make sure that when you go into this thing, you are prepared and have those questions ready to go. You want to be professional. You want to dress appropriately and make sure that you're on time. And I'll share something that happened with me actually on one of the first informational interviews that I went on. I live in the Chicagoland area, had an informational interview with an individual downtown. It was mid-afternoon. I left my house thinking I had plenty of time to get there, and then ran into traffic on the freeway on the way down, and realized there was no way I was going to be able to make it on time for that informational interview. So I was prepared for that. I had the telephone number along. I called and said, I'm so sorry, I'm stuck in traffic. I know I will not be able to make it in time. I hope that we can reschedule in the future. And that individual said to me, I have some time later in the day, please come down and we'll just reschedule it for later in the afternoon. The moral of that story, though, is to be prepared. Again, I made sure that never happened again. I built in extra time to be at that informational interview on time, but I was also prepared in case it didn't happen, to make sure that you do that as well. The next point, importantly, of course, is to be a good listener. The reason that you're interviewing these folks is to gain information, right? It's all about learning. So make sure that you have your questions, but then you're also actively listening as they answer your questions. I always brought a pad of paper along with me and took notes. I always said up front, do you mind if I take notes as we sit through our informational interview? And to a person, they always said, absolutely no problem, please do so. So again, make sure that you're able to actively listen and gather that information. The next point is to be a harvester, right? Hopefully, if you're doing this thing correctly, you'll be able to get some additional contact names so that you continue on with your networking, with your informational interviewing. And again, an informational interview is a great way to get additional contact names. So you don't want to miss out on that opportunity. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, sort of the best way to make that happen. And then another point is to be courteous, right? They're taking time out of their day, and as everybody knows, everybody's days nowadays is extremely busy, and if they're taking time out of their day, you want to make sure that you're thanking them for doing that, because time is critical. Be giving. Ask how you might be able to help them, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as you do informational interviews, in that you are a capable professional with many years of experience. You bring a lot to the table, and that's something never to forget as you go through transition, and never to forget as you're doing your informational interview, because you bring a lot to the table, and you can help these individuals out as much as they are helping you out. For example, as I'm conducting an informational interview with an individual, that person, when we were done, said, I asked them, if I can help you in any way in the future, please let me know. And they said, well, I see from your background that you were in advertising. My daughter's graduating in advertising. Would you happen to know some individuals that she might be able to talk to in the industry, that she could potentially land a position? I was able to provide that person with 3 names, and his daughter actually landed her first job in advertising with one of those individuals' names that I passed along. So again, there's a lot that you bring to the table, and where you can help these individuals out who are taking the time out of their day to help you. Be time conscious. As I mentioned, if you ask for 20 minutes, make sure that you're trying to wrap it up at 20 minutes. And if they say, hey, I've got an additional 10 minutes or we've got a full hour, that's great. Whatever you agree to, make sure that you stick to that time. And then, importantly, be yourself, right? It's the only way, and the reason I bring that up, again, is cultural fit is so important. You want to make sure that you are being yourself so that whatever that next position, that next company that you land at, you feel like you fit in, because, again, you'll be doing your best work, and then hopefully you will be there for some time. And then also, and I don't want to sound too Pollyanna-ish about your job search, because I know how difficult it can be, but if you look at it as a journey, as an adventure, and you have some fun with doing these informational interviews, there's some amazing things that you can learn. One day I was doing an informational interview where I happened to get to there early, so they placed me in this conference room. As I looked around the conference room, I noticed there were all these pictures of what seemed to be backstage at in Broadway somewhere. And there was always this one individual in the same picture who happened to be a nun. And so when the individual that I was doing the informational interview showed up, I asked him, so what's up with these pictures? What's up with this nun? Seems that she's in all these Broadway plays. Well, it turns out that those Broadway pictures were from Rodgers and Hammerstein's play of Sound of Music, and this nun was sort of a technical advisor to Rodgers and Hammerstein for the Sound of Music, which was a pretty neat thing to find out along the way, and he had some interesting stories to share about that. So again, you can just learn some very interesting things along the way. So, all right, how do you conduct an informational interview? Again, this is what worked for me. A suggested approach is, if you're in phase 1 or 2, introduce yourself and recap your background. You want to ask them about their background, and the reason that you want to do that is hopefully get them talking. And what better way to get somebody to talk is to get them talking about themselves. And then hopefully in doing so, it becomes more of a conversation. And at that point, of course, you can ask the questions that you had scripted in advance. And then if it hasn't already happened organically in the conversation, in the informational interview that you've been doing, towards the end, you can ask them if they have any additional contact names. And the reason that you want to do that towards the end is, hopefully you've been able to establish your credibility along the way, and they will feel much more comfortable and willing to provide those additional contact names, right? Because the reason that, and what they're doing when they send you their contact names, they're extending a bit of their own self, a bit of their own credibility and reputation, and they're not just going to give out those names to anybody. They'll do that for individuals who they feel are professional and credible. And then, importantly, again, ask how you can help them in the future, and then thank them for taking the time out of their day to conduct that informational interview with you. So again, that was for phase 1 and 2, right? For phase 3, this is once you've sort of honed it down, and this is a position or maybe the company that you're interested in, how do you do it differently? Again, in many ways it's the same. You're introducing yourself, just briefly recapping the background, but you may ask that hiring manager about their needs, or you may reference some of the research that you've done in advance to talk about something that's critical facing their particular company, or maybe their particular area that they're in, right? And then as you start to talk about things, you can link sort of your background, your skills and abilities as a benefit to answer what their needs might be. So that's important. And actually, an individual from one of my accountability groups that I talked about earlier, she had done this in a process. She was interested in a position at a large company here in the Chicagoland area, knew that there was an opening, and had been able to set up an informational interview with the hiring manager for that position, and she crafted that informational interview very much in the way that I'm talking about here, and that led that hiring manager then to say to her, you know, if you're interested, we have this position, please make sure that you get yourself in on that, for that interview. You can also enter, and again, if it hasn't come up organically in the conversation, you can ask them for any contact names. Again, any other hiring managers that they might be that same level, either within different departments at that same company that you're interested in, or people at that same level at other companies within the industry that you're interested in. Again, it's a small world. These hiring managers will know one another. And if they feel comfortable in giving you those names, it's great to go out and talk to them as well, because, again, you never know. They may have some positions that are open that haven't even been posted yet. Then you can always ask, you know, how you can help them in the future. And again, you might be surprised at ways that you can help individuals about that, and then thank them. And I've got a few questions listed here, and through the CTC, I know that they have a number of great interviewing questions that you can get from the CTC, or of course you can Google. There's so many different sources out there nowadays for the types of questions you could ask, not only in informational interviews, but actual job interviews, and I encourage you to take a look at that. But, you know, in phase 1 and 2, there's a number of different questions that you can ask of those individuals. How rapidly is the field growing? How did you get in your line of work? What do you like the most about it? And then in phase 3, strategic prospecting, there's a number of different questions that you can ask in that area as well. So I won't go through all the various questions there. Again, they're in this Prezi, which, by the way, is online as well, which you can Google and get a copy of if you'd like. So you've conducted your informational interview. What happens after? Of course, you want to make sure that you send a thank you note thanking them again. You can never say thank you enough. And individuals always ask, well, should I send it via email? Should I send it, you know, in a personal note? You know, again, based on what my experience showed, most individuals conduct business via email, so email is a critical way to say thank you. Some individuals like to write personal handwritten notes, which I think is a great touch. And you know, for those individuals, if that's how you would like to do it, I definitely say please go ahead and do it that way. I would just encourage you also, though, to send an email thank you, just because you know, personal notes sometimes can get lost in the mail, or they can take a long time to arrive. So it certainly helps to send that email as soon as you can once you finish up with your informational interview. And then importantly, you want to make sure that you follow up on the leads, right? Any additional contact names that you may have gotten out of that informational interview, you want to make sure that you're following up with them. Again, by giving you those contact names, they're extending their own credibility, and you want to make sure that you do indeed follow up with those individuals. And then, where it makes sense, provide occasional progress updates. And that's certainly something that I did along the way, actually that I continue to do. I just celebrated actually my 7-year anniversary at Loyola University, and I still send out on an annual basis to not all the individuals that I talked with over the course of that informational interviewing that I did, but quite a few of them, just to say thank you so much for the help that you've provided me in my transition. I provide them what happened over the past year in my career professionally, and then always say, you know, if I can help you in any way in the future, please let me know. And you'd be surprised at the number of individuals that will either bounce back and say thank you so much for, you know, keeping me updated, or other individuals who will reach out to me along the way to say, hey, I wanted to follow up with you and see if you could help me out with this. And of course, I'm more than happy to help. those individuals. So, and this is a thank you note that I sent to somebody, and talks about, again, some of the ways that you can help individuals that you may not even know about. This was an individual that I had talked to along the way who worked in at a university in the marketing area, and he was struggling with social media and what's the best way to do that. And I had literally just sat through an excellent presentation from somebody in my accountability group who was a social media guru who had presented an effective use of social media. I was able to take that presentation and pass it along to this individual and help them out in that manner. And they were very, very thankful for that. As a matter of fact, this is that same person who reached out to me a couple months after my informational interview with them to ask me if it was okay to pass along my resume to that president who was looking for somebody in the marketing realm. So again, you never know how you can help somebody and how that may help you in the future. So if you're doing this thing correctly, informational interviewing, and getting contact names, you will quickly find that the number of individuals that you need to follow up with grows exponentially, which is why I have that sort of blurred out picture there. I don't know if anybody remembers the old Wella Balsam commercials, don't tell two friends and don't tell two friends. That's sort of what happens if you're doing informational interviewing well. Right? These people are giving you contact names and you are following up on with them. And what you quickly find is that you need some sort of method to keep yourself organized and on track to follow up with these individuals. I mentioned I'm old school. You know, I printed out my email asks or my LinkedIn asks. I had a 3-ring binder where I wrote down what the key next steps were and when I talked to individuals, all that kind of stuff. That was my sort of organizational approach. Other individuals, you know, will have used Excel. Whatever your method, whatever your approach, you just want to make sure you've got something to keep you organized and on track. Again, because you do not want to let those contact names fall through the cracks. So I wanted to make sure that I stressed that. So any more tips that I have? Talked about this a couple times, but it bears repeating. Be proactive. Again, you are in the driver's seat for an informational interview. You want to make sure that you're making things happen. It's on you. So make sure that you're following up. Secondly, be yourself. Again, wherever it is that you might land, you just want to be yourself along the way so that you can identify that best cultural fit that will ensure you the best chance of success for the future. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. And for those individuals that may be intimidated by actually doing informational interviews, as the person that I mentioned who was the genesis initially of putting this presentation together, you know, practice like you do anything else. Practice interviewing on family and friends first about things that you would be really interested in. And once you do that, you know, you start to feel more comfortable about it, and then you can start reaching out to individuals for informational interviews. And the other thing is, as you're conducting informational interviews, is to build rapport by looking, or perhaps listening, if you're doing it just over the phone, for shared interests, right? And the more and more you can start to have conversations with individuals, the more and more relaxed they become, and the more and more relaxed you become, and the more and more you begin to learn information, the more they're comfortable in letting information flow to you, which is really, really helpful. Again, as I conducted my informational interviews, I tried to do them in person, again, because there's so much that you can learn by visual cues. I tried to do them with the people at their places of employment, because I learned quite a lot sitting in the lobby waiting for them to come and pick me up about the company. I've learned so much about the culture. I learned about the individual when they brought me into their office and what they had, you know, pictures on on their wall, you learn that, okay, they're a Chicago White Sox fan. Great, so am I. I can talk to them about the White Sox, about how good or perhaps poorly they might be doing at the moment. So something to consider there. And then just a couple more slides, and then we can open it up to questions. You know, what did some other people have to say about informational interviewing? What did they see? And this comes from a blog out of the New York Times from a gentleman by the name of Joe Levici. What his comment was, the best way to make someone feel good about granting you an informational interview is to show you deserve the time. What does that mean? You do your homework. You're passionate. You're humble and trying to get out of there in under 30 minutes or whatever the time allotment they may have given you, no matter how well it's going. You want to leave them really knowing two things: how appreciative you are that they've taken time out of their day, and that their advice to you is more than informational. It'll help you get the job done. So that's sort of the good. Here's sort of the flip side. This comes from somebody, again, from that same blog. My favorite was a friend of a friend of a friend who sent me a gushing email and a plea for information about how to get a job in international journalism. So I sat down, wrote a long, thoughtful email and reply. It probably took me like half an hour, explaining how things worked. I didn't receive even a cursory acknowledgement that the email had been received, let alone a thank you. But about 4 or 5 months later, I got a request from the same person essentially asking that I sponsor him for a job in my news organization. Not happen. And so, with that, just want to say vielen Dank, grazie, thank you, and again, if I can help anybody in the future, help you in any way, please let me know. With that, we'll open it up for questions.
That's such great information. Thanks, Marty. So as you're typing in your questions, I do want to remind all of you that you will get a really brief 5-question survey following this webinar. And we'd really appreciate your feedback, not only about this presentation, but also what topics you'd like to see in the future. So I invite each of you to take just a minute or two later today to complete that survey about the webinar series. All right, let's see if we have any questions. No, we don't. Well, with that, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us today for the Art of Informational Interviewing. Marty, thanks so much for your time. On behalf of Career Transition Centers, I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning and have a great rest of your day.